Carl sank into his seat on the crowded airplane and closed his eyes, eager for the long flight ahead to be over as soon as possible. Just as the cabin doors were closing and the attendants began final checks, he felt a sudden jolt against the back of his seat. He turned around to see a young boy, no more than 6 or 7, sitting in the row behind him. The boy had a mischievous grin on his face as he kicked Carl's seat again. "Hey there, can you please stop kicking my seat?" Carl asked in a friendly tone, trying to get the boy to stop before things escalated. The boy's mother sat next to him, completely absorbed in her magazine. Oblivious to her son's antics, she did not look up or reprimand him. The boy's grin widened as he geared up and delivered another firm kick to the back of Carl's seat. Carl clenched his jaw in frustration. This was not how he wanted to spend the next 5 hours. He contemplated alerting the mother, but hesitated to cause a scene. The plane accelerated down the runway, and the repeated kicks continued, each one making Carl's seat lurch forward. He took a deep breath and braced himself for the inevitable next jolts, realizing this was going to be a very long and uncomfortable flight. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Just hours before, Carl had been completely at peace and in a great state of mind. He had arrived early at the airport after a brief business trip in Boston. The last couple of days had been a whirlwind of meetings and presentations. As a senior project manager in a leading tech firm, he was no stranger to the pressures of tight deadlines and high expectations. During the day, he navigated through back-to-back meetings, each requiring his utmost attention and expertise. Sleep was minimal and restless, his mind constantly buzzing with data figures, project timelines, and potential client queries. Despite the exhaustion, Carl felt a sense of accomplishment. He had successfully secured a promising deal, a testament to his hard work and perseverance. Now, waiting at the gate of the airport, he craved nothing more than to unwind, process the events of the trip, and mentally prepare for the upcoming challenges. As the minutes ticked by, he envisioned stretching out his legs, enjoying the extra space and amenities. He had paid extra for the comfort of business class after the high-stress trip. He needed this time to decompress. Right on time, the gate agent announced boarding for business class passengers. Eagerly, Carl jumped up and made his way to the front of the line, his boarding pass in hand. Just a few more steps and he would be relaxing in his seat, unwinding with a drink in hand. But as he approached the desk, the gate agent gave him an apologetic look. "Sir, it seems there's been an issue with our seating. Now this?" He took a deep breath to steady his voice. "What do you mean overbooked? I paid for a business class seat weeks ago." The agent nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Yes, I understand you booked a seat in business class. Unfortunately, we've had several passengers with upgraded tickets show up for this flight, more than we have space for. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience, but we will need to move you to economy for this flight. So because the flight is oversold, I'm the one who suffers," he asked, his voice tense with frustration. "Am I expected to spend the next 5 hours squeezed into this cramped seat, barely any space for my legs, aware of the turning heads and curious glances from nearby passengers?" He took a deep breath, striving to keep his composure. "I know this is frustrating, Mr. Williams," the agent replied. "As compensation, we can offer you a full refund for the difference in fare between business and economy, as well as a voucher for a future flight." Carl shook his head. A voucher wasn't going to relax his frazzled nerves or ease his exhaustion after the taxing business trip he'd just been through. Carl picked up his carry-on bag angrily. He felt his meticulously planned flight home unraveling by the second. "Mike, this is unacceptable," he said. "I expect much better service than this." With an exhausted sigh, he turned and trudged toward the economy boarding line. As Carl slowly made his way through the crowded line, he could feel his frustration growing. Everywhere around him, passengers were jostling for space. The children ran around as their exhausted parents tried to keep them in line, their voices rising in frustration. This hectic scene only added to Carl's own irritation, making him increasingly annoyed with everyone around him. He started to question how he was going to handle 5 hours in such a chaotic environment. Carl made his way down the crowded aisle, scanning the rows overhead Mike Natumlai's Borehen for his seat assignment. Sucking in a deep breath, he plopped down in his seat. But gazing out the window, Carl resigned himself. Just a few more hours of discomfort and he'd be home. He had to stay positive. Just as the cabin doors latched shut with a muffled thud and the flight attendants briskly moved through the aisles for final safety checks, Carl felt a sudden, sharp jolt against his lower back. He turned around to see a young boy no more than 7 years old, his small legs swinging wildly as he repeatedly kicked the scratchy fabric back of Carl's seat. The boy's mother sat next to him, completely absorbed in her magazine, oblivious to her son's antics. Carl closed his eyes for a moment, reminding himself to stay positive. Its kicking would probably only last a few minutes more until takeoff, he reasoned, as the plane began accelerating down the runway. The roar of the engines mounting outside made it harder to ignore each thud against his back. Carl concentrated on calming his breath, resolutely refusing to let this minor irritation disrupt his tranquility for the duration of the flight. Perhaps a gentle request to the boy might do the trick and put an end to the seat kicking. But the constant kicking from the boy behind him was making it increasingly difficult to find that peace. Carl's polite smile faltered slightly as he caught the boy's attention. "Hey there, could you please stop kicking my seat? It's a bit uncomfortable," he said gently, hoping his tone would convey friendliness rather than frustration. The boy, with a mischievous glint in his dark brown eyes, seemed to pause at Carl's voice. Had his polite request worked? Carl smiled while turning back into his seat. Maybe, just maybe, he would have a peaceful flight after all, filled with the symphony of low murmurs and the distant hum of the engines. However, as soon as he turned back, the boy's grin widened as he geared up and delivered another firm kick to the back of Carl's seat. But the kicking didn't just happen once. It started up again, this time with a steady rhythm, as if the boy was treating Carl's seat like a drum. Beginning as the plane smoothly taxied and ascended into the sky, Carl settled back in his seat, his eyes drawn to the tranquil sight of clouds outside his window. Embracing this peaceful moment, Carl made an effort to concentrate on the serene view, attempting to tune out the persistent kicks against the back of his seat. But each kick against Carl's seat felt like a small explosion, jolting him forward. However, after enduring a few more forceful kicks, Carl's patience finally snapped. He quickly turned around and fixed a stern look on the young boy, whose cheeky grin disappeared at once. "You sure have a lot of energy, huh?" Carl said, his voice raised in frustration. His outburst of frustration immediately drew the gaze of nearby passengers, casting a momentary, awkward hush over their part of the cabin. Carl turned back around, feeling his heart pounding from the stir he had caused. His hope, however, was short-lived. The kicking resumed, each thud against his seat feeling more deliberate than before. Until exasperated, Carl turned around again, this time directing his plea towards the boy's mother with a firmness tinted by his growing anger. "Excuse me, could you please get your son to stop kicking my seat? It's very disturbing." The woman finally looked up from her magazine, her expression one of mild annoyance. "Oh, kids will be kids," she shrugged, her voice dismissive. "He's just trying to keep himself occupied on a long flight." Carl felt his anger boiling over at her nonchalant response. His voice, sharp and edged with frustration, cut through the hum of the cabin. Occupied? At the expense of others' comfort? Perhaps then, it's a good time for some parenting lessons, he retorted, unable to mask his irritation. Then the woman's eyes narrowed, taken aback by Carl's blunt suggestion. "Excuse me? Are you suggesting I don't know how to parent my child?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying," Carl snapped, his patience worn thin. "If I had a son, I assure you he'd learn to respect others' personal space, especially in such confined environments." The conversation quickly escalated, their voices rising above the steady hum of the aircraft. Carl's face flushed with anger. "Maybe start by actually paying attention to your child instead of burying your head in a magazine. It's common sense, not rocket science." His words were loud enough to draw even more attention from the surrounding passengers, some of whom shook their heads in some disapproval. The woman, equally incensed, snapped back, "Well, maybe if you had kids of your own you'd understand, but clearly, you're just another selfish person who thinks the world should revolve around him." The flight attendants, now at their row, attempted to calm the situation. "Please, let's lower our voices," one attendant said soothingly. "We're disturbing the other passengers." So what Carl was beyond caring about the disturbance. "This isn't just about noise, it's about teaching respect, something that's obviously missing here," he shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. Suddenly, the elderly woman seated next to Carl now turned to him with a stern but concerned look. "Young man, enough of this now," she said in a direct, no-frills tone. "The boy has stopped his kicking, and you dragging out this argument will not only ruin your peace, but everyone else is here." She gave a pointed look around at the other passengers, some still glancing their way. Carl looked around himself and felt his face flush with red. He was so caught up in the argument that he didn't even realize he had caused such a scene. He realized the woman was right. With a deep sigh, he turned back around, trying to refocus on the tranquility outside his window. However, the boy's mother, overhearing the elderly woman's advice, couldn't resist a final jab. "Yes, listen to the lady. Women are always right, aren't they?" she said loudly, her tone dripping with sarcasm, and Carl's hands clenched into fists once again, his anger reignited by her comment. He struggled to maintain his composure, his mind racing with retorts. But he remembered the advice he'd just been given and, with a monumental effort, chose to remain silent, focusing all his energy on calming his frayed nerves. But then the kicking started again. The passengers around them had seen everything that happened. Their reactions were mixed. Some nodded sympathetically at Carl. They seemed to understand his frustration, probably having showed they felt sorry for Carl. The boy, now silent and wide-eyed, seemed to realize the consequence of his actions. His playful grin had faded, replaced by a look of surprise and a hint of regret. The flight attendants quickly arrived at the scene. The boy sat quietly, no longer kicking, perhaps pondering the direct result of his earlier actions. For the remainder of the flight, the seat behind Carl remained still. No more kicks came. The mother and her son sat quietly, their earlier bravado dampened by the cold splash of reality. Carl leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips. As the plane began its descent, Carl looked out his window feeling a sense of satisfaction. His unorthodox method had succeeded in stopping the incessant kicking and teaching that rude mother and son a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Still, as he watched the clouds drift by below, a hint of unease crept in. Had he gone too far? While effective, his revenge clearly disrupted the flight and upset other passengers. Carl considered the irony of how in trying to defend his peace and quiet, he had sacrificed both if only temporarily. But he quickly dismissed any misgivings. They had started it after all. He had simply finished it creatively and decisively. Still, Carl sighed, realizing he hadn't gotten the relaxing flight home he had hoped for. He gathered his things as the plane touched down. There was no use dwelling on it now. What's done is done. He had just one thought as he stepped off the plane. Next time, he was definitely springing for first class.